Great then. I want you to just take a moment and picture a very specific scene from August 2021. You know the exact one I mean.
Oh, absolutely. I think everyone does. The tarmac.
Exactly. The tarmac at Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul. I mean, those images are just completely, utterly seared into our collective memory, aren't they?
They really are. It was just absolute unimaginable chaos playing out on live television.
It was. You had tens of thousands of desperate souls just, well, swarming the runway, chasing those massive gray American C-17 transport planes.
Right, people physically clinging to the undercarriage as the aircraft taxied.
Yes, and knowing full well, surely, the sheer physical impossibility of what they were attempting. It is undeniably one of the most haunting, visceral images of the 21st century, full stop.
Definitely. It's universally recognized across the globe at this point.
It is. Yet, and this is where it gets fascinating, according to the deeply provocative material we are unpacking today, it is also perfectly, almost entirely, misunderstood.
Yeah, that's the core of it. Because the conventional narrative that settled over those images almost immediately, well, it was incredibly rigid.
Right, very locked in.
Exactly. The global broadcast framed that tarmac as the ultimate symbol of Western decline. You know, a monumental humanitarian tragedy and just a stark moral failure of the American project.
We were told, uniformly really, that we were witnessing a frantic escape from the Taliban, a tragic betrayal of the interpreters, the civil servants, and the loyal allies who were, quite frankly, facing immediate lethal retaliation.
And to be clear, those risks were absolutely real.
Oh, absolutely. The fear of retaliation was a terrifying reality for many people there.
But our source material today, which is a highly contentious essay titled The Magnet and the Empire, well, it suggests we are only observing the surface tension of a much deeper, much older human story.
Spot on. So what we're going to do today is completely re-examine those tarmac images. We're going to look at them through the dual lenses of philosophy and economics.
It's a fascinating approach.
It really is. And then we're going to follow the author down an incredibly detailed alternate history thought experiment. We're asking what might have happened if the British Empire had, well, never left the Indian subcontinent in 1947.
It's a massive what if.
A truly colossal one. Now, before we properly wade into this, I must explicitly state something for you, our listener. We are delving into some highly charged historical and political waters today, aren't we?
We certainly are. Very deep waters.
Indeed. The themes of imperialism, colonialism, foreign occupation, and national sovereignty, they're incredibly sensitive. So I want to be crystal clear right from the off. We, as your hosts, maintain strict neutrality.
Right. We are taking absolutely no sides here.
None whatsoever. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the morality, or the historical assumptions presented in this text. Our mission for this deep dive is simply to report, analyze, and systematically test the mechanics of the thought experiment presented by the author.
Exactly. We are here to navigate the intellectual architecture of the argument and really nothing more.
Spot on. So let's get stuck in. Why do we need to look at this essay's framing of Kabul?
Well, the value of this exercise lies in stretching our historical imagination, you know? It helps us understand human motivation on a mass scale.
Right, stripping away the political rhetoric to see what's actually underneath.
Precisely. To look at the structural incentives, the essay forces us to confront a really glaring paradox about the Kabul evacuation.
Oh, the paradox is striking. Walk us through it.
Well, think about it. For 20 long years, the Taliban fought a relentless, grinding insurgency. And they were continuously promising their followers that their return would be this glorious liberation from a corrupt foreign occupier.
Right, the grand narrative of the anti-colonial struggle.
Exactly. Yet when that so-called liberation finally arrived in August 2021, the vast crowds in Kabul weren't exactly lining the streets with bunting to celebrate the departure of the Americans, were they?
No, quite the opposite, actually. They were surging toward the very military apparatus that had occupied their country for 2 decades.
That's the crux of it. The author's premise is that the crowds weren't necessarily cheering the Americans' departure. They were desperately begging to join them.
It's a profound shift in perspective. The essay argues that the American withdrawal became, essentially through a catastrophic failure of logistics, an accidental immigration pipeline.
Right, an accidental pipeline.
If we look at the author's framing, it just completely upends the traditional narrative. It's as if that airport wasn't merely a place to catch a flight out of a war zone.
No, it was functioning as a lifeboat.
A lifeboat that happened to double as a portal to another universe, quite frankly. For the vast majority on that tarmac, the Taliban's return provided a terrifying catalyst, yes, certainly. But the fundamental drive was about seizing a rare, perhaps singular, exit visa.
Exactly. It was an opportunity to trade a life defined by immense scarcity, arbitrary violence, and institutional volatility.
For a life of structural order and material plenty.
Yes. The physical narrowness of the door is what made the tragedy so acute. There were simply too few planes and just way too little time to accommodate a hunger that is deeply rooted in the brutal geography of global fortune.
The brutal geography of global fortune. That's a brilliant phrase. And to illustrate the sheer scale of this underlying economic desperation, the author asks us to participate in a specific thought experiment.
Right, the section they term the universal lottery.
I have to say, I found the mechanics of this universal lottery section deeply unsettling, mostly because of how utterly plausible the underlying psychology is.
It's very confronting.
It really is. So the author asks us to imagine a scenario where American or Western passenger aircraft were to suddenly land tomorrow morning in the teeming, bustling cities of South Asia. We're talking Lahore, Dhaka, Mumbai, Colombo.
Just massive, densely populated urban centers.
Exactly. Now, suppose the pilots simply announced over a loudspeaker, "We are departing for North America, Australia, and Western Europe. Board if you wish, completely free of charge, with guaranteed residency upon arrival."
It's a wild hypothetical, but the author calculates that the resulting stampede would dwarf the chaos of Kabul by orders of magnitude.
Without a doubt. We wouldn't be talking about thousands of people converging on an airport, would we?
No, we would be talking about tens of millions.
Tens of millions.
Yeah.
Just entire populations, massive demographic swaths of young, able-bodied professionals and laborers attempting to uproot themselves in a single afternoon.
The infrastructure of these cities would just completely buckle under the sheer weight of people trying to reach the tarmac.
Right. But we have to look closely at the why here, because it strips away a lot of our comfortable, perhaps slightly arrogant Western assumptions.
It does, because the essay asserts it's not because these millions of people are political dissidents secretly yearning for the philosophical ideals of the Enlightenment.
No, they aren't all sitting around reading Locke and Rousseau.
Yeah.
It's driven by cold, hard, material reality, isn't it?
Absolutely. For the average young person in those developing cities, the Western liberal democratic state is the modern-day El Dorado.
El Dorado. That's it, exactly. We are talking about the basic scaffolding of a functional life that you and I simply expect as a baseline. We just take it for granted.
Completely for granted. Things like reliable electricity that doesn't suffer rolling blackouts.
Paved roads that don't literally wash away during the monsoon season. Salaried employment paid in a stable currency that isn't eroded overnight by hyperinflation.
And functioning courts. Courts where property disputes aren't settled by who can pay the largest bribe to a local magistrate.
Yes, the rule of law. The right to a secular education for daughters. And most foundationally, an environment where children don't succumb to preventable diseases or localized violence.
A harsh modern truth is laid bare in this section, I think. The author points out that a Pakistani carpenter who risked his life crossing the Aegean Sea in a rubber dinghy,
or suffocating in the back of a lorry in the Balkans. It's horrific.
It is horrific, but he isn't typically doing it for an abstract notion of political freedom or democratic representation.
No, he is risking drowning for German wages. He's risking it for the physical security of the European Union and the promise of a reliable pension.
Exactly. Similarly, the Afghan engineering student who clung to the undercarriage of that C-17, he wasn't necessarily dying for a specific political ideology.
No, he was dying for the material world that the C-17 was flying towards, the material magnet of Western modernity. And the thing is, this magnet doesn't require a sophisticated propaganda department, does it?
Not at all. It advertises its superiority in every remittance envelope sent home from a relative in London or New York.
Spot on. And in every endless winding queue outside a Western consulate in Islamabad or New Delhi, people know what's on offer.
They absolutely do. So if we accept this premise, it leads us directly into what the text calls the second paradox of the Kabul evacuation.
Right. Let's unpack this second paradox.
Well, we have this jarring, almost surreal juxtaposition caught on camera during the evacuation. On the perimeter of the airport, you have Taliban fighters, heavily armed, sporadically clashing with American forces.
Yes, they are actively asserting their ideological and territorial control.
Right. But just yards away, ordinary Afghans families with luggage, mothers clutching infants, young educated men, they were rushing right past them toward the departing American planes.
It's an incredible visual. It completely shatters the illusion of a unified national resistance to foreign empire.
It does. The very same movement that battled the foreign occupier for 20 years, ostensibly on behalf of the Afghan people, had to stand by and watch as a massive cross-section of the urban populace voted with their feet.
Voted against the restored emirate, essentially. The essay argues this exposes a profound, irreconcilable cleavage within the society itself.
Yes. On one side, you have ideological and tribal militants who are driven by religious zeal and rural honor codes.
And on the other side, you have this vast urban populace drawn inexorably toward material possibility and bureaucratic modernity.
Both the fierce resistance to the empire and the desperate aspiration to join it were captured in the exact same camera frame.
It's a stunning observation. And the aspiration was pointing firmly west. It forces a rather uncomfortable reflection on our own baseline of comfort, I dare say.
How so?
Well, if you consider the roads you drove on today, the pension scheme you pay into, the healthcare system you trust to treat your family in an emergency, if all of that were suddenly violently stripped away overnight.
And replaced by a system of arbitrary theocratic rule with zero economic foundation.
Exactly. What lengths would you go to? What wouldn't you risk to regain that baseline of modernity?
It's a terrifying question. And to understand the specific depth of that yearning in Afghanistan, we really must trace the exceptionally turbulent timeline of Afghan modernity as the author outlines it.
Right. We have to look at the historical progression of what was painstakingly built and what was systematically destroyed. Let's map out that timeline because it provides the crucial context for the 20-year American occupation.
Okay, so the text describes the period prior to 1979 as possessing a fragile, albeit limited, stability.
Under the monarchy and the early republic, yes.
Right. Afghanistan was impoverished and largely tribal, definitely, but there was a nascent modernization occurring, particularly in Kabul.
Yes, you had expanding secular education. Women were beginning to participate more fully in urban professional life. There was a functioning, if small, state apparatus.
It wasn't a Western utopia by any means, but it was a distinct foundation for a modernizing state.
But then that foundation was entirely pulverized in 1979.
Completely pulverized. The Soviet invasion and the subsequent decade-long occupation devastated whatever fragile modernity had taken root.
We saw millions of Afghans fleeing across the borders into Pakistan and Iran as refugees. National infrastructure was quite literally reduced to rubble by aerial bombardment.
And agriculture, which was the absolute backbone of the economy, just collapsed. This was due to the mining of rural areas and the destruction of irrigation systems.
Furthermore, you had a whole generation radicalized through a jihad that was heavily financed and armed by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia.
Right, as a Cold War proxy conflict against the Soviets.
A geopolitical proxy war that left the country in absolute ruins, which led directly into the brutal, chaotic civil wars of the early 1990s and subsequently the rise of the first Taliban emirate.
And the author is unsparing in describing the conditions under that first emirate as almost medieval.
Oh, truly grim. Female education wasn't just discouraged, it was entirely banned by edict.
Yes. Priceless cultural heritage, like the Buddhas of Bamiyan, was blown to dust in acts of just senseless ideological vandalism.
And subsistence scarcity wasn't merely a tragic byproduct of conflict, was it? The author argues it was practically enforced as state policy to maintain control over a fractured, starving population.
It's incredibly bleak. But this profound deprivation sets the stage for the American interlude running from 2001 to 2021.
The American interlude. Now, the essay is careful to note that the transformation during this 20-year period was heavily concentrated in urban centers, wasn't it?
Yes, it was fragile and often plagued by systemic corruption. Let's be clear about that.
Right, it wasn't perfect. But it was a material transformation nonetheless. Kabul evolved from a shattered, traumatized wasteland into a bustling city.
You had glass towers, horrendous traffic jams, and modern shopping malls. New universities were producing a nascent, ambitious professional class.
Women were returning to study engineering, law, and medicine. You had beauty salons, internet cafes, independent media outlets springing up, all alongside the architecture of a modern state, a new constitution, a parliament, a functioning bureaucracy.
But here is where we must dig into the mechanics of the occupation. Why did the Americans and their coalition partners build all this?
This is a crucial point. The text insists it wasn't a massive altruistic charity project. They didn't deploy to the Hindu Kush simply to build girls' schools out of the goodness of their hearts.
No, absolutely not. The development was deeply integrated into American counterinsurgency doctrine.
Right. Explain how that doctrine works in practice.
Well, the billions of dollars poured into paving ring roads, erecting ministries, expanding airports, supplying hospitals, they were deployed because, in the minds of the military planners, development served security.
Ah, so winning hearts and minds.
Exactly. The strategic calculation was that neutralizing insurgents required visible, tangible, material progress. You cannot permanently pacify a population simply by dropping leaflets or conducting night raids.
No, you have to build roads that allow farmers to get crops to market. You have to keep the electricity grid functioning.
Right. The modernity was essentially a weapon of war.
Okay, I understand the doctrine, but I have to push back strongly on the timeline the author is using here. 20 years, I mean, in the grand sweep of history, 20 years is absolutely nothing, is barely a single generation.
That's a fair critique.
The essay brings up the Meiji Restoration in Japan as a historical contrast for rapid modernization. But look at Japan. Their modernization took decades of incredibly disciplined, voluntary, and often painful effort directed by their own internal elites, didn't it?
Yes, they adapted Western models because they recognized an existential necessity, and they did it on their own terms.
Exactly. So I put it to you, considering the trillions of dollars spent and the massive military umbrella provided, why did the Afghan modernity fail so spectacularly to take root? Why did the entire state apparatus, the army, the bureaucracy, just evaporate the minute the planes took off?
It is the pivotal question of the entire intervention, isn't it? And to answer why it failed to root, the author turns to the 19th century German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel.
Right, Hegel. Always a bit of a dense philosophical thicket, but highly illuminating if we can unpack the mechanics of it. Let's not just drop the term. What is Hegel actually asserting about how history moves?
Well, specifically, the text leans heavily on his concept of the List of Vernunft, or the cunning of reason.
The cunning of reason. Break that down for us.
Hegel's philosophy of history argues that human progress does not advance linearly through noble intentions or moral design.
So it's not just good people doing good things to push us forward.
Exactly. Instead, history advances through the selfish passions, material interests, and cold, often brutal strategic calculations of its actors. People, nations, empires, they pursue their own narrow, self-serving goals.
Right. They're looking out for number one.
But in the process of pursuing those selfish goals, they produce massive, complex, unintended outcomes that actually push the dialectic of history forward.
Can you give us an example of that?
A classic Hegelian example is Napoleon. He was driven by personal ambition and French imperial conquest.
Absolutely. The man wanted an empire.
But unintentionally, through his conquest, he spread the legal and administrative reforms of the French Revolution across Europe. The reason of history uses the passions of men as its tools.
Oh, that's brilliant. So applying that to the American project in Afghanistan, the mechanics become quite clear. The United States did not invade Afghanistan on October 2001 with the primary passionate goal of building glass towers in Kabul.
No, or ensuring Afghan women could study civil engineering.
Right. The passion, the driving force, was raw, defensive self-interest. To destroy al-Qaeda, to kill Osama bin Laden, to prevent future terrorist attacks on the American homeland, and to project power into a strategically vital region. That was the calculation.
Exactly. But the result, the unintended consequence generated by this cunning of reason, was that American guns, logistical supply chains, and pragmatic counterinsurgency dollars accidentally burst a modern infrastructure.
Accidental modernity.
Yes. In their attempt to stabilize the country for their own security, they unintentionally fostered a generation raised in contact with globalized media, secular education, and technical training.
They accidentally created a massive cohort of English-speaking professionals, contractors, and civil servants who had internalized, or at least begun to adopt, the habits of bureaucratic modernity.
So the U.S. acted out of purely selfish strategic necessity, but the overarching march of history utilized that selfishness to accidentally construct a modern Afghan middle class.
It's a fascinating application of the theory. But here's the rub. If the cunning of reason built it, why didn't it survive?
Because, as the author notes, while institutions can be built overnight with enough capital, they require generations to achieve deep cultural internalization.
Ah, I see. A bureaucracy isn't merely a concrete building in Kabul, is it?
No, it's a complex web of cultural habits, shared assumptions, and societal trust. The rule of law has to become a cultural reflex, not just a performance enacted while foreign donors are watching.
That is perfectly said. The modernity in Afghanistan was caught in this agonizing, irresolvable tension.
It was trapped between ancient, deeply rooted tribal honor codes and this sudden, imported bureaucratic aspiration, a society suspended between the traditional madrasa and the Western-funded university.
The roots were just incredibly shallow. It hadn't been organically internalized over centuries. It was an artificial biosphere propped up entirely by the foreign military presence and a constant fire hose of foreign capital.
Therefore, when the American military logistics suddenly vanished, the modernity they had inadvertently built was left entirely exposed.
Without its life support, the institutional framework simply withered under the pressure of the returning insurgency.
Exactly. The cunning of reason generated a fragment of modernity, but it could not dictate its permanence. The 2021 images of the airport freeze that exact agonizing moment in time. A structural gap between two vastly different worlds that was simply too wide to bridge in a mere 20 years.
This analysis of loyalty and institutional survival brings us to what I consider the most provocative claim in the text. The author's overarching thesis about the nature of political loyalty, which they title the Gibraltar Principle.
Yes, the Gibraltar Principle. This is where the essay really challenges conventional political science.
It certainly does. Now, if we look at the standard mid-20th century anti-colonial narrative, the assumption's quite rigid, isn't it?
Very rigid.
It insists that oppressed or colonized peoples will inevitably organically rise up to overthrow their imperial administrators. It assumes that the drive for self-determination, for flying one's own national flag, is a paramount, universal human desire that trumps all other concerns.
But the text begins laying out specific historical examples where that narrative completely falls apart.
Yes, let's go through those. The author meticulously examines territories where you would expect to see clamorous, violent independence movements, but where they simply never materialized.
The first major example is the Falkland Islands in 1982.
Right. When the Argentine military junta attempted to annex the islands, ending British rule, the local population didn't exactly welcome the Argentines as liberators, did they?
No, they fiercely resisted. And they actively pleaded for the British government to send a naval task force halfway across the world to protect their status as a British overseas territory.
They wanted to remain British. The essay then pivots to Hong Kong in 1997, which is an even more potent example, I think, given the sheer scale of the population and the economy.
Right, absolutely. As the handover from British administration to Beijing's sovereignty approached, the global media didn't capture mass, joyful celebrations of liberation from the British crown in the streets of Kowloon.
No, quite the opposite. There was profound mourning, deep anxiety, and a massive exodus. Residents were desperately queuing for hours outside government offices.
Queuing to secure British national overseas passports. They were deeply fearful of what the introduction of Chinese sovereignty would mean for their civic freedoms and economic stability.
Spot on. And of course, the namesake of the principle, Gibraltar itself.
Right. Despite immense geographic logic and relentless political pressure from Madrid, the population of Gibraltar continually and overwhelmingly chooses to maintain their association with Britain.
They vote for it in democratic referendums over independence or integration with Spain. So let's connect the dots here. What is the fundamental underlying pattern the author's identifying across the Falklands, Hong Kong, and Gibraltar?
The pattern reveals that in all these cases, the populations made a deeply calculated, highly rational choice. The material benefits provided by the administrative power proved to be far stronger than the psychic appeal of a national flag.
By material benefits, we mean extraordinary prosperity, physical security, access to global open trade.
And most importantly, the reliable, predictable application of the rule of law. That proved to be a more durable binding agent than ethnic nationalism or nominal sovereignty.
The text uses a phrase here that I suspect will anger a lot of political scientists. It describes nationalism as a luxury belief.
It's a deliberately provocative term. The argument is that nationalism, the fervent, romantic desire for a fully independent, sovereign nation-state, is effectively a luxury good.
Right. It is an ideological pursuit that a population can only truly afford to indulge in after their foundational needs have been firmly established. Needs for physical security, economic stability, and legal predictability.
Yes, if your family is starving, or if your business can be arbitrarily seized by a corrupt local court with no recourse, you simply do not care what color the flag is flying outside the courthouse.
No, your primary driving concern is establishing a system that works. Tying this Gibraltar principle back to the Kabul tarmac is incredibly sobering, isn't it?
It really reframes the whole event.
When we view the evacuation through this lens, the people running toward those C-17s were not rejecting Afghan culture or their own identity. They were reacting with sheer panic to the catastrophic overnight withdrawal of the material conditions that had briefly made a modern, predictable life possible.
They understood, with what the author brilliantly terms the directness of the dispossessed, that what was taking off from that runway wasn't just a foreign army retreating.
No. It was the entire architecture of their lives. It was their daughter's education, their professional salaries, their physical safety, all rolling down the tarmac and lifting into the sky.
Which leads us to the crux of the author's historical inquiry.
Right, the big question.
If this Gibraltar Principle is an absolute historical law, if prosperity, security, and the rule of law reliably and consistently outweigh patriotism as a force binding populations to political arrangements, what does that mean for the history of empire itself?
And this, listener, is where we take a massive, spectacular leap into the alternate history thought experiment. We are going to apply this Gibraltar Principle to one of the most famous, consequential imperial exits in human history.
It's a bold thought experiment.
It's brilliant. Let's firmly set the historical stage. The year is 1945. World War II is just concluded. In our actual live timeline, the British Empire is utterly bankrupt.
Exhausted, morally depleted, and financially ruined by the war effort against Germany and Japan.
Exactly. Consequently, they rapidly withdraw from the Indian subcontinent in 1947, leading to the creation of independent India and Pakistan.
Accompanied, of course, by the tragically violent, chaotic partition that left millions dead and displaced.
Yes, an absolute tragedy. That is the history we know. But the author asks us, what if the geopolitical calculus had been different?
The author asks us to imagine a counterfactual 1945 where Winston Churchill, instead of focusing solely on Britain's domestic exhaustion, looks at the global map and identifies a far greater, more immediate existential threat.
The Soviet Union.
Yes. He sees the Soviet Union under Stalin not just consolidating power in Eastern Europe, but looming heavily over Asia. He sees Soviet influence pressing hard toward Iran, Afghanistan, and the Khyber Pass.
So in this alternate timeline, Churchill concludes that abandoning the Indian subcontinent isn't a noble act of decolonization. It is a catastrophic geopolitical surrender.
Exactly. And to prevent this surrender, Churchill realizes he has to make a monumental, unprecedented gamble. He knows he cannot hold India alone.
No, Britain doesn't have the money. So what does he do? He packs his bags and crosses the Atlantic in early 1946 for a deeply classified mission to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Harry S. Truman.
The essay paints this incredibly vivid, tense scene. You can almost see it. Churchill unfolding a massive topographical map across a conference table in the Oval Office.
Cigar in hand, no doubt. And the text provides a modified version of his famous Iron Curtain speech, tailored for this specific Asian crisis.
Let's hear it.
I want to read this excerpt because it perfectly distills the alternate geopolitical stakes. In this timeline, Churchill leans over the map and says to Truman and the American generals, "From the Caucasus through Iran and Afghanistan toward the Khyber Pass, Soviet influence advances. Imagine Britain withdraws from India. What follows? A divided subcontinent, competing national governments, religious violence, weak institutions, economic collapse. Communist parties will exploit this immense disorder. Moscow will not need to invade India with tanks. It will simply wait for instability to invite intervention. British India possesses enormous manpower, modern ports, vast industrial capacity, control of oil routes, and direct access to the Indian Ocean. If we abandon it now, we surrender Asia's center of gravity to tyranny."
It is an incredibly potent strategic argument.
It's Churchill at his most persuasive.
And we have to analyze how the American intelligence and military establishments would evaluate this in 1946. They look at Churchill's map, they look at the emerging Cold War dynamic, and they realize the strategic logic is sound.
Right. If the Indian subcontinent fragments into sectarian chaos and economic ruin, the Soviets don't have to fire a single shot.
Exactly. They merely fund local insurgencies, wait for the collapse, and eventually their geopolitical influence bleeds all the way down to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean.
And the implications of that are terrifying for Washington. I mean, Soviet influence in the Indian Ocean means potential Soviet control over Middle Eastern oil routes, dominance over the Strait of Hormuz, and the ability to choke vital global shipping lanes.
The threat to global trade and the entire strategy of containing communism would be fundamentally compromised.
Consequently, in this thought experiment, the Americans execute a shocking, paradigm-shifting policy pivot. In a post-war world where everyone fully expected the United States to champion global decolonization and dismantle the old European empires, Washington publicly announces that it fully endorses Britain's continued administration of the Indian subcontinent.
It's a massive reversal. They classify it as a supreme matter of global national security, asserting that a unified, British-administered India is the only viable bulwark against Soviet expansion in Asia.
But, as we said, a public endorsement from Washington doesn't pay the bills in London. Britain is still broke. So the thought experiment introduces a massive, unprecedented economic lever.
Yes, the Asian Recovery Program.
It is, in essence, a Marshall Plan, specifically designed and earmarked for British India. We are talking about billions of dollars in American capital, heavy industrial machinery, agricultural technology, and vast amounts of food aid pouring into the ports of Bombay and Calcutta.
The explicit drive and goal of this immense capital injection is to build overwhelming economic resilience.
Right, to fight poverty.
Exactly. The Americans and the British realized that the most fertile ground for communist revolution is abject poverty. Therefore, to deny the Soviets their favorite weapon, you must rapidly enrich the populace.
You cannot easily foment a Marxist uprising if the agricultural peasant is rapidly transitioning into a comfortable, property-owning middle class.
Exactly. So in this timeline, you suddenly have an empire that is mandated by London, but financially underwritten and strategically protected by the world's newly minted superpower.
Now, I have to stop you here. The geopolitical theory is sound, I grant you that. But we have to look to reality on the ground in 1946. You cannot just wave an enormous American checkbook and expect the deeply entrenched Indian independence movement to suddenly say, oh, brilliant American money, we'll just cancel the revolution, then carry on.
No, absolutely not.
I mean, the Indian National Congress, under leaders like Nehru and Gandhi and the Muslim League under Jinnah, they were expecting imminent independence. They had been campaigning for decades. When London announces they are indefinitely suspending independence, all hell must break loose.
The author fully acknowledges the immediate explosive backlash. The text details how, upon the announcement that the empire is staying, local political leaders erupt in fury.
As well they should.
Massive coordinated strikes, colossal protest marches, and intense campaigns of civil disobedience sweep across major urban centers. Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, Lahore. The subcontinent threatens to tear itself apart.
So how on earth does this alternate empire survive that initial wave of unrest without instantly devolving into a continent-wide bloodbath?
The survival relies on a two-pronged strategy. Overwhelming initial force followed immediately by unprecedented structural economic development.
Let's talk about the force part first. Operation Iron Shield.
Right. London, backed by American logistics, responds to the uprisings with ruthless, decisive military and administrative action. British and Loyalist troops move rapidly to secure all critical infrastructure.
The railways, the deep-water ports, the telegraph networks, and the power grids.
Yes. Draconian emergency powers are enacted across the subcontinent. Key political organizers and nationalist leaders are swiftly detained or exiled.
And crucially in this scenario, the British Indian Army, which was a highly professional, well-equipped, and historically loyal institution, largely holds the line, preventing mass mutiny.
Yes. By controlling the logistics and decapitating the leadership, organized mass resistance is effectively broken within a matter of months.
But, as Churchill himself knew from history, you cannot govern a massive subcontinent forever merely by pointing a bayonet at it. Force is a temporary holding measure. It is not a system of governance.
No, it's not sustainable.
So, having secured the territory, Churchill pivots immediately. He stands up in the House of Commons and delivers a mandate that changes the course of the century. We will not merely govern India, we will enrich it. And this declaration kicks off the Imperial Development Initiative.
This initiative forms the absolute core of the alternate history. It becomes the most ambitious state investment and industrialization program in the history of the British Empire, entirely fueled by the limitless credit of the American Marshall Plan.
Suddenly, the landscape of the subcontinent is radically transformed. The vast, antiquated railway networks are electrified and expanded to reach remote provinces.
Massive steel processing plants, colossal hydroelectric dams, and modern motorways are constructed at breakneck speed. New technical universities and scientific research institutes rise up in major cities.
Recognizing the cheap labor and new infrastructure, Major British and American manufacturing firms relocate significant portions of their production to India.
But the social engineering goes further than concrete and steel. They enact a massive educational integration program, sending thousands of the brightest young Indian students to Oxford, Cambridge, and American Ivy League institutions on imperial scholarships.
And they return not as colonized subjects, but as the new, highly paid imperial elite. Right?
Exactly. Engineers, senior administrators, corporate managers. The overarching strategic goal is to fundamentally transition India from a traditional agrarian extraction colony into the absolute indispensable industrial heart of a modernized commonwealth.
Precisely. And this is where the Gibraltar principle is tested on a massive continental scale. The strategy is to apply the economic model of Hong Kong, instituting strong, inviolable property rights, a predictable common law judiciary, and open global trade policies to hundreds of millions of people.
And the economic results, according to the text's projections, are staggering. By the mid-1950s in this timeline, a Punjabi farmer is utilizing American tractors and earning substantially more than he ever could have in a fractured, struggling, independent nation.
A Bengali civil servant in Calcutta enjoys a secure state-backed pension and holds savings accounts in sterling. Gujarati merchants are freely trading across a massive protected imperial network that stretches continuously from Singapore to Dubai to London. I take your point on the sheer volume of the economics, but I must inject a fierce dose of reality here.
Let's look at the psychology of sovereignty.
Surely you cannot simply buy off a population's deeply ingrained, multi-generational desire for self-determination and dignity with electrified railways and a reliable pension scheme. I mean, to use a modern analogy, it sounds a bit like enduring a terribly toxic, humiliating corporate job simply because the dental plan is fantastic.
That's a very apt analogy.
Human beings crave agency. Look at Catalonia in Spain, or the Basque region, or even Scotland in the UK. These are regions with high standards of living, integrated economies, yet the nationalist independence movements remain incredibly fierce and deeply rooted. How does the author account for that deeply human, visceral desire for sovereignty, which economics alone often fails to extinguish?
That is the most critical vulnerability in the entire thought experiment, and the author actually anticipates this exact critique.
Do they? How so?
The essay explains that the British administration realized they couldn't just offer economic bribes while maintaining a racially humiliating dictatorial grip from London. They had to fundamentally restructure the political architecture of the state into what the text calls a federal empire.
A federal empire. Okay, unpack that for us.
Well, the author notes that Britain had learned incredibly painful, bloody lessons from its past imperial miscalculations, specifically the disastrous loss of the American colonies in 1776 and the grueling, violent struggle for independence in Ireland culminating in 1922.
Right. They knew what didn't work.
Exactly. The strategists in London realized that centralized, absolute dictatorial rule over a modernizing, educated populace was politically radioactive and ultimately unsustainable.
So, if they aren't ruling by absolute fiat from Whitehall, let's unpack the mechanics of this federal empire.
Yeah.
How does the taxation work? How does the governance actually function on a day-to-day basis to appease that desire for agency?
The solution was radical devolution. London devolved substantial, genuine legislative and executive power to newly created provincial parliaments across the subcontinent.
Crucially, they created separate, autonomous political spheres for Hindu-majority and Muslim-majority provinces, didn't they?
Yes. This allowed them to manage their own internal cultural affairs, education systems, local policing, and civil laws. Local taxation funded local schools, local roads, and local hospitals, managed entirely by elected Indian politicians.
Right. However, and this is the linchpin of the federal empire, London retained absolute, unquestioned control over the macro-level issues of state sovereignty, defense, foreign policy, and the issuance of currency.
Exactly.
Ah, I see the machination now. So the local elites, the politicians who might otherwise be leading violent rebellions, are co-opted.
Think of the prestige, the titles, and the genuine, tangible power of governing their own people on a daily basis.
But, and this is vital, they do not have to bear the crushing fiscal and security burdens that come with full sovereign independence.
That is exactly the dynamic. The text draws a very sharp, illuminating contrast to our actual timeline here. In our reality, a Pakistani general or a post-independence Indian prime minister must spend a massive, crippling portion of their national budget struggling against internal insurgencies, managing hostile borders, and funding a massive standing army.
Right, huge defense spending.
But in this alternate British India, That local provincial administrator doesn't worry about external borders. They focus purely on civil development, economic growth, and local infrastructure, because the British Exchequer in London and the Royal Navy are entirely underwriting the external security guarantees of the subcontinent.
It is a brilliantly cynical, highly effective way to neutralize political friction while maximizing economic output. And the essay describes how this structural reality completely defangs the traditional nationalist movements over a period of decades.
Let's imagine the 1950s and 60s in this timeline. You have veteran leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru still taking the podium, still passionately demanding Swaraj or absolute self-rule.
But the text suggests the audience has changed.
Yes. When he gives a soaring romantic speech about the dignity of the flag, a local mill owner or a rising tech entrepreneur interrupts to ask incredibly pragmatic, difficult questions. Right? Questions like, if we throw the British out, do we immediately lose our imperial trade preferences in London and Sydney? Will the Royal Navy still protect my cargo ships in the Indian Ocean? Will my son's scholarship to Cambridge be revoked? Who guarantees the currency?
The author argues that political rhetoric, no matter how soaring or historically justified, struggles immensely to compete with the gravity of rising wages, reliable electricity, and profound civil stability.
By 1960, the demographics had shifted. You have a massive new generation of Indian professionals who were educated in British institutions and returned to the subcontinent as corporate managers, civil engineers, and bureaucrats, not as revolutionary agitators.
And crucially, when this new wealthy middle class looks out beyond the borders of their federal empire, what do they see happening in the rest of the decolonizing world?
They see absolute, unmitigated chaos.
They do. They see newly independent African nations almost immediately descending into brutal civil wars, ethnic cleansing, and military coups. They see Vietnam burning in a horrific ideological proxy war. They see neighboring Burma sliding into a dark, isolationist military dictatorship that impoverishes its people for decades.
And compared to that surrounding sea of post-colonial chaos, their own dominion, with its multi-faith civil order enforced by British law, its functioning, predictable legal framework, and its unprecedented upward economic mobility, well, it looks like an incredibly safe harbor, doesn't it?
It does, and the political ecosystem adapts to this reality. The massive Congress Party, rather than fighting a guerrilla war for independence, rebrands. It shifts from a revolutionary anti-colonial movement into a massive social welfare lobby operating within the imperial parliament to argue for better local schools, more hospitals, and higher wages.
And the Muslim League transforms into a devolution party, fiercely protecting the rights of Muslim-majority provinces, but doing so entirely within the legal framework of the empire, rather than seeking to physically tear it apart to form Pakistan.
The author Riley notes a fascinating sociological shift here. The fierce Quit India radicals of the 1940s ended up, 20 years later, filing their taxes, buying comfortable suburban properties, and anxiously ensuring their children passed the entrance exams for Oxford.
So nationalism essentially became a cultural pastime, a romantic topic for poets, academics, and historical theorists to debate in cafes.
Exactly. While the vast, powerful professional middle class aggressively defended the crown, they defended it because their life savings were tied to its stability, and they recognized that the alternative to empire wasn't a utopian republic. It was sectarian disorder and economic ruin.
The Gibraltar effect proved decisive on a continental scale. Loyalty ultimately followed prosperity and security, not ideology. Which brings us inevitably to the final and perhaps most arresting analytical section of this deep dive, the 2026 mirror.
Right, bringing it to the present.
The author asks us to drop the alternate history for a moment and look closely at the stark, often tragic contrasts between our actual reality today and the theoretical world of this alternate timeline.
If we examine our actual timeline in 2026, what is the dominant geopolitical narrative regarding South Asia and the Middle East? We see exactly the phenomenon we discussed at the very beginning regarding Kabul.
Yes. We see desperate, continuous waves of migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka undertaking horrific, exploitative, and frequently fatal journeys to reach the borders of Europe and North America.
They are risking drowning in the Aegean Sea in overcrowded rubber dinghies or suffocating in the back of sealed lorry containers crossing the Balkans.
And again, to reiterate the core theme of the text, they are not, by and large, making these harrowing journeys to seek abstract political asylum because they wish to write dissenting political pamphlets.
No, they are undertaking these journeys for the exact same underlying reasons the Irish fled the famine in 1847 or the rural Italians migrated in the 1950s. They are fleeing for the promise of stable wages, for institutional reliability, for physical safety from arbitrary violence, and fundamentally for the future viability of their children.
The calculus driving this mass movement is almost purely economic and structural.
But in the alternate timeline presented by the author, that entire geopolitical calculus is inverted. In this scenario, British India is the economic magnet.
Because it industrialized rapidly and heavily and continuously over 80 years, crucially, without the catastrophic generational trauma and sectarian violence of the 1947 partition, it functions like a continental-sized Hong Kong.
Furthermore, Afghanistan itself, falling under this much stronger contiguous British-American sphere of influence, sees railroads, secular education, and industrial development bleeding over its borders, rather than becoming an isolated, impoverished pipeline for global jihad.
So instead of a desperate outward flight of human capital to the shores of Europe, you have massive dynamic internal migration. Ambitious young people from across the region are flocking to Delhi, Bombay, and Calcutta because that is where the capital, the security, and the opportunity reside.
And the essay proposes a fascinating, almost comical scenario for the late 1970s in this timeline.
Oh, I love this part.
Imagine a progressive British politician stands up in the House of Commons in London and suggests, given our commitment to global democracy, perhaps it's finally time we grant India its full sovereign independence and withdraw our administration.
The reaction across the subcontinent is sheer panic. The Indian stock markets shudder and crash. The currency trembles. Newspaper editorials from Karachi to Madras run frantic, bold headlines demanding that the empire remain in place.
You have mass, organized marches in the streets of Bombay, but they are not demanding independence. They are fiercely protesting against the threat of British withdrawal.
It's an incredible reversal. The author compares this hypothetical scenario to the actual referendums on separation that failed so decisively in Quebec in 1995 and in Scotland in 2014.
Right. When the romantic rhetoric of independence is finally placed on a ballot against the cold, hard reality of economic integration and shared currency, populations routinely vote with their feet, and their feet stay firmly planted in the soil of prosperity and institutional certainty.
Now, putting my BBC hat firmly back on for a moment, I must interject with a vital, non-negotiable note of historical reality and impartiality here.
Of course.
We've spent an hour discussing a theoretical, prosperous empire. But the actual British Empire, as it existed in our documented history, was very often brutally, ruthlessly extractive.
It was.
It drained local resources for the benefit of London. It deliberately suppressed and dismantled local Indian industries to favor British factories. And it maintained rigid, deeply offensive racial hierarchies that entirely undermined any claim to moral legitimacy.
That is a vital, necessary distinction. The historical empire was built on subjugation.
Indeed. So we must be explicitly clear to you, our listener, that the author of this essay is not defending, romanticizing, or apologizing for the empire as it actually was. They are exploring a hypothetical, radically different developmental empire.
They are imagining an empire that was forced by the immense geopolitical pressures of the Cold War and American oversight to completely reinvent itself.
Exactly. It is a thought experiment testing the specific thesis that shared, distributed prosperity is a vastly superior adhesive for political loyalty than military coercion or ethnic nationalism.
Right. The text uses this alternate history to posit a very hard, unsentimental lesson about statecraft. Economic dependence is the most durable, unbreakable form of political dependence, provided, and this is the key caveat, provided it operates through a framework of individual rights, legal predictability, and genuine upward mobility rather than naked racialized extraction.
The author forcefully argues that a newly independent nation with a shattered economy, corrupt courts, and fleeing professionals isn't free in any meaningful daily sense of the word. It is merely ungoverned.
Ungoverned. That is a chilling, highly precise word.
It really is.
It is the reality of the modern world, because human beings will always inevitably attempt to flee an ungoverned space at the first opportunity. Just as the Afghans desperately tried to leave the tarmac in 2021, and as citizens of Syria, Yemen, and Venezuela attempt to leave today.
Conversely, a prosperous, integrated dominion one with rising wages, secure property rights, and unshakable external security guarantees acts as an impenetrable fortress of civic contentment.
Citizens might write beautiful, nostalgic, patriotic poetry about the lost game of independence, but at the end of the day, when the bills are due, they will fiercely, violently defend the administrative hand that feeds them.
The hand that educates their daughters in safe schools, and that guarantees the hospitals remain open and fully stocked.
Exactly. Which brings us, in a rather haunting full circle, right back to where we started this deep dive. The sun-baked tarmac at Hamid Karzai International Airport.
Indeed it does. To summarize the expansive intellectual journey the author has taken us on, we have to revisit Hegel's Cunning of Reason one last time.
History is definitively not a linear moral march of progressive improvement. It is messy, it is deeply ironic, and it operates through immense human suffering and constant geopolitical miscalculation.
The essay's ultimate argument is that empires built purely for cynical extraction sometimes accidentally seed the enduring institutions of self-governance. Wars launched for pure defensive self-interest sometimes inadvertently produce the foundations of modernity.
And tragically, military withdrawals that are intended as noble moral liberations can sometimes produce unmitigated, generation-defining catastrophes.
It all ultimately comes down to the brutal reality of material conditions, doesn't it?
It really does.
Whether we are analyzing the 20-year American tutelage in Afghanistan or exploring this vast imagined developmental British Empire across South Asia, the central thesis remains absolute. Material conditions, physical security, and economic predictability shape human loyalties far more effectively and permanently than any national flag, any rousing anthem, or any abstract political ideology.
That is the ultimate unyielding takeaway from the author's exploration. Empty stomachs and collapsing, unpowered hospitals make terribly poor nationalists.
Such a powerful line.
When the American military logistics departed Kabul, they took the fragile architecture of modernity with them. The people running after those planes on the runway understood that reality with a terrible absolute clarity because they had seen the alternative.
They weren't just running away from the ideology of the Taliban. They were running toward a world that functioned.
Empty stomachs make poor nationalists.
That is a phrase that is going to stay with me for a long, long time. It forces us to completely reevaluate those haunting Kabul images. We can no longer look at them merely as a specific, isolated historical tragedy of a botched military withdrawal.
No, they stand as a universal, timeless marker of human nature.
They show us, in the most visceral terms imaginable, exactly what human beings will risk to reach and secure a stable, functional reality for themselves and their families. Now, as we bring this extensive deep dive to a close, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final, completely new and rather provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We've spent this time thoroughly discussing the Gibraltar Principle, the author's assertion that material conditions and prosperity reliably outlast geography, national flags, and physical borders. But let's project that principle forward into our immediate future.
Okay.
What happens when the physical nation-state is no longer the sole or even the primary provider of that essential prosperity and security? As we witness the accelerating rise of remote work, borderless digital economies, artificial intelligence, and decentralized financial networks, could we see a future where the Gibraltar Principle detaches from physical geography entirely?
Oh, wow. That's a huge thought.
Could there come a day, perhaps very soon, where our deepest, most fierce and defensive loyalty belongs not to the country whose passport we hold or the physical soil we happen to live on, but to the digital cloud, the decentralized network, or the global corporate entity that actually pays our wages, secures our digital property, and guarantees our economic future? If prosperity truly trumps patriotism, what happens to the world order when prosperity lives entirely in the cloud? Something substantial to chew on whilst you go about your day.
A truly fascinating and profoundly unsettling question to end our analysis on.
Indeed it is. Well, that is all the time we have for today. I want to warmly thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex, somewhat labyrinthine journey through history, philosophy, and the mechanics of what-ifs. It has been an absolute pleasure to unpack it all with you. Until next time, take care and goodbye.